If the first two sections of this story have carried you through the layout and meaning of ancient Persian gardens, their geometry, engineering, and the quiet symbolism behind their design, then this final chapter must walk with you through their slow decline. Not a fall with fire and ruin, but something quieter. The kind of erosion that comes from politics, fashion, and forgetting. The whisper, once cultivated with such care, began to fade. But why? And what replaced it? To understand the garden's disappearance, we must step back into the corridors of empire, not during its rise, but during its long, slow breath out, decline through splendor. The sound grows louder during the Safavid dynasty 1501-1736. Persian gardens reached a peak of refinement. Cities like Isfahan bloomed with public gardens, vast promenades, and open squares bordered by fountains and orchards. Under Shah Abbasi, Isfahan was redesigned into a city of order, beauty, and planned greenery. Travelers from Europe marveled at the symmetry, the waterworks, the silence, but something had changed. The old, intimate philosophy of whispering gardens hidden away behind walls, entered in private, gave way to performance. Public avenues opened gardens to crowds. New constructions emphasized grandeur over introspection. The trees were still there and the water still flowed, but now the whispers were drowned out by markets, by festivals, by courtly pageants. Gardens became less about cosmic reflection and more about imperial display. One could argue this was inevitable. As Persia interacted more with the Ottoman Empire, Mughal India, and European visitors, it adopted new architectural languages. Influence moved both ways. The restrained garden of Cyrus and Darius now had to compete with the ornamental displays of Versailles and the structured gardens of Istanbul. Even the Mughals, once deeply Persianate in taste, shifted towards spectacle in their later constructions. What had once been a coded message of control, soft water, shadowed paths, silence was slowly drowned in louder forms of power. The whisper was no longer needed, or no longer heard. The forgotten Gardeners' dynasties weakened, so did the systems that maintained the Khanats. These ancient underground tunnels required constant attention. If neglected for even a season, the shafts collapsed, silt gathered, flow slowed. In places like Yazd, where the survival of whole towns depended on Khanats, this was a death sentence, and so, as the imperial centers expanded and decayed, smaller communities were left behind. Gardens in provincial cities withered, the canals dried, trees fell without replanting. Sometimes the land was reclaimed for agriculture. Other times, it was simply left alone, a dry courtyard where birds now nested in the place of philosophers. The records, when they exist, show the transformation in detail. A 19th century inventory from a garden in Kerman lists only 2 remaining trees out of the original 40. The water allotment had been cut in half. The gardener's stipend unpaid. For 6 years, this was not destruction. It was neglect. And neglect for a garden is enough. Colonial eyes, changing aesthetics be the 19th century, with Persia caught in the political vice between British and Russian empires. Even the idea of what a garden should be was shifting. Western styles were imported. European botanists brought new species. Foreign architects proposed designs that had more color, more symmetry, more spectacle. Travelers described Persian gardens now as quaint or melancholic. Their stillness, once a source of pride, was reinterpreted as decay. Some gardens were restructured to please foreign visitors. Others were paved over for palaces or military installations. Few realized they were dismantling a philosophy, not just a planting scheme. The old meanings, cosmic harmony, the garden as paradise, the whisper as power, were lost in translation, and yet some of the silence remained, hidden between the tiles of forgotten courtyards. Gardens as memory, not space. Be the 20th century, much of the Persian garden's physical infrastructure had disappeared or fallen into disrepair. But its idea persisted. In literature, in folklore, and even in refugee memory, the garden remained a symbol of peace, order, and survival. In the poetry of Hafez, Saadi, and Rumi, gardens became metaphors for the soul. To prune the self, to water one's thoughts, to walk beneath the branches of wisdom. These were mental acts, spiritual duties. Even when the gardens themselves dried, the metaphors did not. In rural homes, people still designed their small courtyards in the same four-part plan. A single tree, a shallow basin, a wall to keep out the sun. The idea was not grandeur, it was balance. For families who had once worked as canal diggers, memories of the tunnels were passed down. A father might tell his son how to listen for the water, how to detect soil that was alive beneath. A mother might show her daughter how to sweep a stone path so quietly that the birds wouldn't fly away. And so, while the physical gardens may have whispered less, the cultural memory continued to murmur. The return of the whisper in recent decades. A quiet revival has taken place. UNESCO now lists several Persian gardens as World Heritage Sites, including the Fin Garden in Kashan, Yaram Garden in Shiraz, and Shada Garden in Mahan. Restoration efforts have aimed not only to save the architecture but to revive the atmosphere, the controlled flow of water, the ordered planting, the silence between footsteps. Modern architects and landscape designers are rediscovering the values embedded in the ancient Kahar bag. In a world of constant noise, the whisper has new value. More than ever, cities are turning to the logic of Persian gardens to design cooling spaces in arid environments. The passive air conditioning, the shaded corridors, the slow water channels, these are being studied again not as relics, but as solutions, and perhaps more quietly. There is a renewed appreciation for stillness, a recognition that power does not need to shout, a garden does not need to dazzle, and that true survival often depends not on grand designs, but on slow, deliberate ones. So the next time you see a garden with a quiet path and a trickling channel, stop, listen. It may not be loud, but it speaks, and what it says is old. You stand on a narrow stone bridge just wide enough for a donkey cart, watching the water ripple beneath you. A gentle current moves through the river yon, shaded by poplars and flanked by mud track roads that turn into sleet-slick trouble. By autumn, ahead is a low stone structure, part house, part office. There's a wooden arm fixed to a post lowered across the road like a question mark. You've reached a toll station, and behind the half-closed shutter, someone waits to collect. There, not a soldier, not a priest, not even a merchant. They are a piège or a toll collector, and this is medieval France, between the 12th and 14th centuries, a time when every crossing and corner of the kingdom could cost you a coin. This is not the story of kings and crusades. It is the story of mud, measures, and murmured complaints. A story not told in monuments, but in receipts. Let's open the ledger. The birth of the toll booth toll collection in medieval France began as an informal affair. In theory, tolls were an ancient right banalides paid to the local seigneur or ecclesiastical landlord in exchange for passage through their lands or over their bridges. But by the High Middle Ages, the system had expanded beyond necessity into a dense web of petty fees and local privileges. Need to cross a bridge? Pay. Want to use the river for shipping? Pay. Passing through a town gate after sundown? That's extra. By the 13th century, toll booths were not merely checkpoints. They were economic instruments, sometimes even investments. Lords sold the right to collect tolls to individuals, often for a fixed annual payment, creating an early form of tax farming. The result was a class of semi-official, semi-despised figures, the toll collectors. These men and occasionally women became permanent fixtures of roadsides, bridge ends, and market squares. They lived with their ledgers, their weights, and their suspicions. A day in the life of a piège toll collector's life was not glamorous. It began before dawn. The shutters were opened, the barrier lowered, and the booth warmed with a small fire of wood gathered by family or bought with precious sous. Travellers arrived in a steady trickle, peasants taking chickens to market, merchants with mules laden with salt, clerics on borrowed horses, sometimes nobles in gilded carriages, with no intention of stopping. The toll collector had to judge weight, contents, destination, and worth, often by sight alone. Written toll tables did exist in some places listing standard fees for grain, wool, cheese, and wine, but they varied wildly from region to region and from week to week. A cart of apples in May might cost half what it would in November. Everything depended on local scarcity, politics, and negotiation. Then there were exemptions. Clergy often claimed immunity. Nobles waived their rings. Monks quoted obscure privileges. And soldiers, well, they simply passed through. If the toll collector pressed too hard, they might be threatened, assaulted, or worse, accused of abusing the king's peace. But if they didn't press at all, they might be out of a job. It was a position that required tact, memory, and a talent for appearing less educated than you actually were, and always, there was record keeping. Transactions were noted on parchment or in wax tablets, though many toll collectors were semi-literate. Symbols often stood in for words: a goose for poultry, a wheel for wagons, 3 dots for 3 sous. Errors weren't just frustrating, they were criminal. A mistake in a royal toll report could mean dismissal, imprisonment, or worse, a lawsuit from a lord who expected his share. So much for boring, right? Yet for the peager, each day was an exercise in quiet survival. The toll booth. As Theodoto the common traveller, the toll booth was more than an inconvenience. It was a place of tension. Some tried to bribe their way through. Others pretended not to understand the local dialect. A clever merchant might hide goods beneath hay or misreport a weight. Toll collectors responded with tricks of their own unannounced. Inspections, lifted cloths, tested barrels. Some booths employed measurers who used iron rods or primitive balancers to weigh carts. Others simply watched the road with practiced eyes. A man who had spent 30 years measuring loads of grain could spot a short sack from 50 paces. Still, disputes were common. A minor disagreement over toll classification could delay a traveller for hours. In towns like Clamecy or Sens, petitions were sometimes filed in local courts over a single coin. In larger towns, toll collectors worked under official oversight, but in rural areas, they ruled their stretch of road like petty kings, with ledgers and suspicions. And what of corruption? It existed, of course. Toll collectors were accused of underreporting income, pocketing coins, favouring friends, or inflating weights. But many lived modestly, even poorly. The truth was, the booth was not a path to riches. It was a survival post, and the peager's biggest enemy was not the dishonest traveller, it was boredom. Hours passed with no visitors. Rain ruined ink. Livestock escaped. Fires burned low. The only distraction sometimes was a page from a travelling monk's manuscript, or gossip from the last wagon to pass. It said that one toll collector near Ozier spent his free hours composing poems on bark. Another carved tally marks into the wooden lintel above his booth, not to count money but years. The toll web, fragmentation and redundancy of toll collection had been a centralized system. It might have streamlined trade. But this was medieval. France, a mosaic of seigneuries, bishoprics, duchies, and urban communes. Each entity claimed toll rights, often within a few miles of each other. A merchant traveling from Lyon to Paris could pass through dozens of toll stations. Each bridge, each river ferry, each city gate had its own fee. The result was a tangle of overlapping claims, each defended by custom, precedent, or force. Documents from the 14th century describe entire convoys of wine or wool grinding to a halt, as toll officers argued over jurisdiction. In some cases, toll stations collected fees multiple times, once when entering a town, again for using the road, and a third time for crossing a bridge built a century earlier. Travelers began to develop strategies. They used lesser-known roads, paid guides to lead them around toll stations, used night crossings, paid forgeries. In some areas, toll maps circulated crude but effective diagrams showing where to expect a fee and where to slip through unchallenged. And yet, despite the confusion and cost, the system persisted. Why? Because tolls didn't just fund lords, they funded infrastructure. The maintenance of bridges, roads, and ferries relied on those coins. Without tolls, passage became dangerous. Unmaintained roads turned to mud. Flooded bridges collapsed. Ferries stopped running. In a sense, tolls were irritating but essential, like a tooth that ached but still chewed. When silence spoke loud. Perhaps the most telling part of the toll collector's world was not the shouting of angry travelers, or the rustling of coin purses. It was the quiet. In winter, the road might lie bare for hours. The collector would listen for hoofbeats, the grind of wooden wheels, or the echo of voices from far off. In those silent hours, many peagers embroidered, carved spoons, counted coins again and again, not out of greed, but to feel time passing. Some toll booths became places of folklore. One was said to be haunted by a drowned merchant. Another, rumoured to be the hiding place of a knight's treasure. But most were just cold outposts on the long, weary web of medieval travel. They were not places of drama. They were places of waiting. And yet, by the 15th century, something had begun to change. New roads were built, trade patterns shifted, towns consolidated their toll rights, royal oversight expanded. The humble toll collector began to fade from the edge of the road. But why now? What changed? What finally made the kings of France question Whether this fragmented, whispering system of tolls was more trouble than it was worth. The toll collector's booth still stood at the edge of the bridge, but by the early 15th century, the world was moving on. Wheels turned faster, traders took new routes. Kings, once content to let local lords and bishops bicker over tolls, began to look at the system with a wider lens and found it wanting dot in this section. We'll examine how the once deeply entrenched toll system fragmented, frustrating yet fundamental began to unravel. Slowly, as always in history, and quietly. There were no revolts, no bonfires of booths, just paperwork, royal decrees, economic necessity, and the whisper of centralization. What had been a patchwork of petty rights became a question of national efficiency. And in the heart of that shift, toll collectors, once semi-autonomous roadside arbiters, became clerks, then caretakers, and finally, footnotes. From fief to crown, centralization begins. Decline of toll collection as a local institution cannot be separated from the larger story of state formation. By the 14th century, the French monarchy, battered by war, rebellion, and plague, began an ambitious project: consolidation of power. Kings like Philip IV the Fair and Charles V realized that if France were to survive against enemies like England and Burgundy, it could not remain a scattered realm of semi-independent toll zones. Armies could not march freely if they had to pay at every gate. Trade could not flourish under the weight of redundant charges. And the crown itself, deeply in debt from war and court expenses, needed control over revenue. Thus began a quiet, persistent campaign, the repurchasing or confiscation of toll rights. In some cases, the king negotiated with nobles or monasteries, offering pensions or lands in exchange for their toll claims. In others, tolls were absorbed through legal maneuvering declared null due to outdated charters, poor record keeping, or abuses reported by travellers. One by one, the toll posts that had once lined the countryside came under royal jurisdiction. But this was not efficiency for efficiency's sake. It was about reliability. The king wanted to know what money would come in and where it would go. Local toll systems were often opaque, poorly documented, and vulnerable to corruption. Royal inspectors were dispatched to investigate abuses. Reports from the 1370s describe collectors in Normandy skimming as much as 40% off the top. Some were arrested, others simply vanished before the law could reach them. With the rise of centralized oversight, toll collection began to professionalize, and with it came a kind of dullness. No more carved tally marks above the door. No more haggling over pigs and wheels, just forms and silence. The cost of fragmentation. The system's inefficiencies were glaring, even in its heyday. A merchant traveling from Avignon to Paris, a journey of roughly 600 kilometers, might encounter 30 to 50 toll stations, depending on the route. Each stop meant delays in inspection, uncertainty in pricing, additional guards or bribes to speed. Things up. In the 14th century, the Paris Merchants Guild and other urban economic organizations began to lobby against these excessive tolls, arguing they discouraged long-distance commerce. Letters preserved in city archives contain carefully detailed complaints. At Bourgogne, the piager demanded triple the posted rate for salt. At Troyes, the grain was weighed again and the sack opened, though sealed, all for 2 sous, and the delay of half a day. The economic pressure began to mount. France's internal markets depended on smoother passage. Towns demanded standardized tariffs. Merchants proposed fixed routes with predetermined fees. And in some cases, tolls were even prepaid in bulk, proof that what had once been a local, face-to-face transaction was becoming abstract, ledger-based, and distant. The toll collector's personal judgment was no longer valuable. The state preferred numbers. The silent zone experiments in the early 15th century. Several zones franches or free trade zones were established in France not for ideological reasons, but as a kind of economic experiment. In regions like Champagne and parts of Languedoc, certain tolls were temporarily suspended to see whether trade would increase, revenue would rise elsewhere. For example, through increased market activity, the burden of enforcement would be reduced. These zones became known among traders as les couloirs muettes, the silent corridors. No arguments at the bridge, no leaning collectors squinting at oxen hooves, just open passage. And the results? Mixed at first. But over time, it became clear where tolls were reduced or eliminated, trade flourished, more goods flowed, markets expanded, taxable activity increased. The whisper of profit grew louder than the complaint of toll collectors. The silent corridors began to spread. This was not done without resistance. Local lords protested the loss of income. Collectors begged to keep their posts, but the writing was on the walls, sometimes literally, as decrees were nailed to gates. Henceforth, no toll shall be levied on goods of market bound for royal cities. Where once there had been dozens of booths per province, now there were only a handful. Some were moved, some abandoned. The river crossings, once lined with barriers and booths, became still. The changing role of the collector by the 16th century, many toll collectors were no longer independent contractors, but salaried agents of the state. Their job was to apply fixed tariffs, issue receipts, and submit reports to central offices. The work was less dangerous, less profitable, and far less personal. Gone were the days of shouting matches with mule drivers. Now, collectors worked inside more formal structures. Some even wore uniforms. Instead of carved symbols or shorthand ledgers, they used official stamped forms. For many, the job became a kind of bureaucratic purgatory. Predictable, repetitive, safe. A description from a 1532 inventory of a toll office near all ANS notes: 1 desk, 3 ink pots, 1 table of tariffs, and 4 wooden stools. The collector is in good standing, though complains of numbness in winter and dullness in trade. It was the toll collector's quiet lament, not that the work was hard, but that it was boring. The peasant may have hated the old peager. The merchant may have avoided him. But the booth had once been alive with voices, gestures, conflict, and calculation. Now it was paper. When the booths were forgotten, some toll stations simply fell into disuse. Others were absorbed into nearby towns and became storage sheds, small dwellings, or were repurposed entirely. One former toll house near Tours became a wine merchant's cellar. Another was converted into a shrine, and some just crumbled abandoned as roads changed course and bridges collapsed. Yet the memory of the peager lingered. In peasant tales and village jokes, he remained a sly figure, half bureaucrat, half trickster. The man who could count a cow's worth in candlelight. The woman who knew whether a basket was worth 2 sous or 4 without lifting the lid. In a few rural areas, the term peage remained in use long after the booth had vanished. As a synonym for minor inconvenience. Ceased un vai peage, someone might mutter, standing in line at a market. It meant a bit of a wait and not worth the cost, a trace of history, worn smooth by centuries of use. So by the early modern era, toll collectors had lost their power, their posts, and their place on the road. But not all tolls disappeared. The question now is this: if the king wanted trade to flow more freely, how would he pay for the roads?